Hunter S. Thompson, journalist, author, political commentator, arguably one of the most original voices in American literature. For many, however, his name is synonymous with drugs, excess, anarchy, and one groundbreaking book, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. First published by Rolling Stone in 1971, the novel was an innovative mix of journalism and fantasy, fiction and non-fiction, one that spoke to the disillusionment of a generation, that captured the crazed cultural zeitgeist of its time, a summation of the hysteria and paranoia that gripped the nation in the wake of the counterculture, Watergate, and Charles Manson. As you can imagine, filmmakers were immediately keen on bringing Thompson's masterpiece to the silver screen. Though the novel was eventually adapted by director Terry Gilliam in 1998, Fear and Loathing meandered through development hell for more than 20 years, with several major directors trying and failing to put it before the cameras. Rights issues, creative differences, clashes of personality and vision all conspired to sabotage any attempt at cinematic translation. The most serious effort came just before Gilliam stepped in, and was to be helmed by British director Alex Cox in the mid-90s. Cox had written a script, cast his lead actors, put together his crew, met with Thompson, and supposedly even secured the budget, before it all suddenly unraveled. And even after Gilliam finally succeeded, the production continued to cause trouble for its key players, leaving, for many of those involved, an unfortunate legacy of bitter resentment. This is a complicated, Rashomon-esque story I'm about to tell. There are many different versions of the events leading up to the making of this film, depending on who's giving the account. I don't know ultimately what the real truth is, but I've tried to represent everyone's side as accurately and objectively as possible. I'll leave you to decide for yourself which version you believe. But remember, like the book that inspired all this madness, every testimony recounted here is likely to contain just as much fact as it does fiction. Fear and Loathing began its life as a small job offer from Sports Illustrated. Hunter Thompson was then an up-and-coming journalist, mildly famous for his first non-fiction book, Hell's Angels, published in 1966, and attracting a major audience with his wildly inventive first-person reporting style, dubbed gonzo journalism. He was an enthusiastic drug abuser, a non-stop drinker, and his substance-fueled antics frequently usurped whatever subject he had been hired to cover as the main focus of his writing. Thompson's only real subject was Hunter Thompson. In 1971, he received a call from Sports Illustrated, hiring him to cover the Mint 400 desert race in Las Vegas, Nevada. Already struggling to finish an article he was writing in collaboration with attorney and Chicano rights activist Oscar Zeta Acosta, Thompson figured a drug-crazed trip to Vegas would be perfect fuel for the two of them to complete their work. What resulted has become legend. Thompson and Acosta ran amok across Vegas, dropping acid, huffing ether, destroying 2 separate rental cars and thousands of dollars worth of hotel property before miraculously escaping the entire ordeal basically unscathed. The Mint 400 story was a complete bust. Thompson hadn't even bothered to cover it, but his experience rekindled an old idea he had been playing with for years, a novel about the American dream. Using his trip with Acosta as the foundation for the story, as well as a second trip taken a month later, which he would condense into a single deranged weekend, Thompson wrote like a madman, turning out a scathing indictment of American excess and consumerism, a hallucinatory eulogy for the love generation, and one of the best books of the 20th century. Topped off with some dementedly brilliant illustrations by Thompson's friend and co-conspirator Ralph Steadman, a Welsh animator with a vicious and unhinged creative eye perfectly matched to his own, Fear and Loathing seemed poised to make quite an impression. And that it did. Immediately upon its publication later that year in Rolling Stone, split into 2 parts and credited to Thompson's alter ego Raoul Duke, it elevated him to the status of literary celebrity. Every college student in the 70s devoured the book. Every major actor or artist of that decade wanted the honor of simply hanging out with him, and just about every working filmmaker wanted to adapt gonzo journalism to the screen. The mission to turn Fear and Loathing into a movie was on. However, that mission was largely spearheaded not by a director, but a producer, Layla Nabulsi. Nabulsi was a young production assistant working on Saturday Night Live around 1976 or 77, when she first met Thompson. They were introduced by mutual friend John Belushi, and by 1980, the two were passionately in love. Even after their split around 1982, when Nabulsi found she could no longer keep up with Thompson's rock and roll lifestyle, she would remain close with him professionally and personally until his death in 2005. Only a few years after their split, she had acquired the film rights to Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, intent on guiding its adaptation. Hunter Thompson had already had a long history of flirtation with Hollywood. Aside from the efforts to adapt Fear and Loathing, there was Where the Buffalo Roam, released in 1980. Based in part on Thompson's article The Banshee Screams for Buffalo Meat, written in remembrance of Oscar Acosta, who mysteriously vanished in 1974, as well as numerous other works, the film starred Bill Murray as Thompson, and Peter Boyle as Acosta doppelganger Carl Laszlo Esquire. Art Linson, producer of the hit comedy Car Wash, made his directorial debut on the film, and though many have praised Murray's performance, including Thompson himself, Where the Buffalo Roam was an unmitigated disaster critically and commercially upon release. I've actually always really liked this movie. It's funny, it's got some surprisingly good performances, a great soundtrack, and brings to life some of Thompson's best writing. I think it's rather underrated. Nonetheless, it was a thoroughly disappointing experience for Thompson, who clashed heavily with Linson, disagreeing with many of his artistic choices. Nearly simultaneous to the production of Buffalo in the late 70s, Thompson himself tried to break into screenwriting, penning a story on marijuana smugglers in Key West, Florida, co-written with novelist Tom Corcoran and titled Cigarette Key. The project had been commissioned by Paramount Pictures, who developed the deal with Rolling Stone founder and longtime Thompson editor Jan Wenner. The script never got past the initial treatment stage, which acts as a basic outline of the story, but rumor has it both Michael Mann and Oliver Stone were courted as directors. Actor Sean Penn was apparently interested in adapting Thompson's work at several points in the 80s and 90s as well. He is said to have purchased the rights to both The Curse of Lano, Thompson's Hawaiian-set follow-up novel to Fear and Loathing, and The Rum Diary, one of his earliest works dating from the early 60s, which wasn't published until 1998. The Rum Diary later was adapted into a film in 2011, one that marked the return of writer-director Bruce Robinson, the mind behind cult comedy classic Withnail and I, after a nearly 2-decade-long absence, and starred Johnny Depp in his second on-screen appearance as Thompson. As far as I know, Penn had no involvement in this film. And it wasn't just the world of film that courted Thompson, it was also the world of theater. Playwright Lou Stein adapted Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas to the stage around 1981 or 82, with performances taking place in London, England. Stein neglected to actually seek Thompson's approval for this stage adaptation until the last minute, when he invited Thompson to the premiere. The inevitable violent retaliation was narrowly avoided when Thompson saw the play and discovered he greatly enjoyed it. Nabulsi accompanied him on that fateful trip to London to view the stage version, and she credits Stein's work as being the main inspiration for her ambition to produce the film version. But first, she would have to deal with one of the property's major roadblocks, the long-running rights issue. Back in '71, Fear and Loathing had been blocked from publication by Oscar Acosta. He was outraged that Thompson had, as he saw it, stolen his personality and elements of his life as material for his book. He was offended that Dr. Gonzo, the novel's fictionalized Acosta double, was referred to as Samoan and not Hispanic. He demanded that Thompson give him the credit he felt he was due. After threatening numerous lawsuits, Acosta was finally appeased in 1972 when the publisher, Random House, agreed to print a photograph of him with Thompson in Vegas on the book's back cover, allowing everyone to know definitively who the real Dr. Gonzo was. But book publication and movie adaptation are two very different things. For years, anytime the possibility of a film was discussed, Acosta's threats of lawsuit would resurface. It wasn't until after his disappearance in 1974 that any serious talks could take place regarding an actual production effort. And when Nabulsi began her earliest attempts at the adaptation, around 1982, she discovered that the movie rights were in a strange legal gray area. Thompson had carelessly sold them to a man by the name of John Juergens, the heir to the Juergens hand cream fortune, in 1972 or 73 for $25,000. Juergens, along with some business partners, established a production company, Shark Productions, and had attempted to produce the film at one point or another. But apparently, Thompson never actually signed the contract. He had taken the money, which is technically legally binding, but had never put down his signature. When Nabulsi finally tracked Juergens down a few years later, she was able to negotiate a deal that would give her control of the rights for 7 years, before they would revert back to Thompson. She figured 7 years would be plenty of time to get a film off the ground. She got a hold of Lou Stein and hired him to write a first draft. The two took their own trip to Vegas and hammered out the script, which would go on to be rewritten several times, not including attempts by other writers who were unassociated with Nabulsi. But she soon realized that there were bigger problems than the script. Namely the problem of financing. In the mid to late 80s, with the Reagan administration cracking down on drugs, material like Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas was anathema. Nobody wanted anything to do with it. Unable to gain any traction, Nabulsi began to grow frustrated, even discouraged. She went back and forth trying to decide whether or not she wanted to keep going on this project against such adversity. Eventually, her love of the material gave her the determination she needed, so she moved to LA and started learning the ropes of Hollywood producing. She made connections with agents and producers, worked on some films including Prizzi's Honor, and went back to SNL to work as an associate producer. A major breakthrough came for her with the release of Gus Van Sant's Drugstore Cowboy. She wasn't actually involved in the making of this movie, but as she perceived it, the film's success meant that drug material was becoming less of a taboo. Perhaps Van Sant would even be the perfect choice as Fear and Loathing's director. Although he showed interest and had several meetings with Nabulsi, he eventually dropped out to make My Own Private Idaho. Back to square one, she sent the book and the current version of the script to everybody she possibly could. Directors like the Coen brothers and Greg Araki, actors like Jack Nicholson and Marlon Brando, both of whom she wanted to star. At some point, she apparently made a deal with Ridley Scott's company. Jake Scott, Ridley's son, was set to direct, before financing fell through. The film was stalling over and over again until, in 1992, with her 7-year window about to expire, Nabulsi was approached by Stephen Nemeth and Harold Bronson of the newly formed Rhino Films. Rhino Films, an offshoot of the Rhino Records label, wanted Fear and Loathing to be their first production, and by 1994, a deal was struck with Nabulsi, Thompson, and Juergens. Rhino would move the film forward independently, with a budget of $5 million. This is where things start to get serious, and seriously complicated, because everyone has their own version of how this production went down. Before we go any further, I'd like to take a moment to mention a few of the other production attempts that were happening concurrent with Nabulsi's throughout the decades. Not much is really known about these attempts, and some are nothing more than rumor, but I find them interesting nonetheless. It's said that Martin Scorsese was set to adapt the film in the late 70s, with Dan Aykroyd playing Raoul Duke and John Belushi playing Dr. Gonzo. Oliver Stone took a crack at it at some point, and in the 80s, animator Ralph Steadman tried to put a deal together on Nabulsi's behalf with Handmade Films, the company founded by George Harrison to produce classics like Monty Python's Life of Brian and Terry Gilliam's Time Bandits. Ralph Bakshi, the underground animator behind films like Fritz the Cat and The Lord of the Rings, claims to have struggled for some time to direct an animated version, done in the style of Steadman's illustrations, but was never able to secure permission. Obviously, none of these endeavors ever got very far, but now, in the mid-90s, it looked like it was finally going to happen. Again, there was a time limit. With Rhino Films now holding the rights, they had until January 1997 to start shooting, or those rights would expire. By October 1996, there wasn't even a script. The search for a director and a writer entered overdrive. Among the filmmakers being considered were Jeff Stein, Liani Chazo, and Lee Tamahori. Apparently Nabulsi even briefly considered directing the film herself, but soon the list was narrowed down to two names, Tamahori or Alex Cox. Tamahori had a few serious meetings and even flew out to Thompson's home in Aspen, Colorado to discuss the film, but likely due to scheduling conflicts, the deal stalled. So Rhino Films went with Cox. Cox had experienced early career success with his anarchic debut Repo Man and his critically acclaimed sophomore follow-up Sid and Nancy, but lately he had been faltering. His spaghetti western satire Straight to Hell had met with a hostile reception, and his subversive historical biopic Walker had met with an even more hostile reception, effectively ending his chances at being a Hollywood filmmaker. That was okay for Cox though. Hollywood disgusted him. He spent the next few years in Mexico, doing a little acting and directing an award-winning Spanish-language feature called Highway Patrolman. His work as a music video director for artists like the Pogues, Debbie Harry, and Iggy Pop was also helping to re-establish his name in the US. Fear and Loathing was to be his triumphant return to American filmmaking. But from his perspective, the production was woefully disorganized, inexperienced, and actively conspiring against him. He claims he was hired in a last-minute, desperate attempt to get the film going before the rights expired, and to bail the production out of an actor problem they had worked themselves into. The part of Raoul Duke had attracted many of the biggest stars of the time: Keanu Reeves, John Cusack, Matt Dillon, Johnny Depp, even John Malkovich. According to Cox, Rhino had offered the part to Cusack and Depp simultaneously, and it was left to him to sort out the mess. Thompson apparently wanted the final choice on whom he would be portrayed by, and his favorite was clear: former teen idol turned Hollywood star Johnny Depp. Depp had met Thompson while on vacation in Aspen in late 1995, and they had hit it off immediately, both of them happening to share Kentucky roots. He was also the favored choice of Nabulsi, who saw him not only as the one with enough star power to get the film financed, but also the one with the talent and the commitment to do the part justice. Thompson himself asked Depp to star in the film in 1996, while the actor was on location making Donnie Brasco, before the Fear and Loathing production had even come together. Perhaps the reason for the later confusion with Cusack. As you probably already know, Johnny Depp eventually won the lead. Not long after, Benicio del Toro was brought on to play the volatile Dr. Gonzo. Both of them began launching into intense research and preparation for their roles. Still under constant pressure from the impending rights expiration, Cox went away to put together a script with his writing partner Todd Davies, and here was where the real trouble started. Cox and Davies would eventually turn out 3 drafts of the script, each of which followed the novel fairly closely, with a few relatively minor changes and additions. They shifted scenes around, cut all of the flashbacks to the San Francisco hippie scene, and organized the story, more or less, in straightforward chronological order. The final film would end up taking a much more fractured approach to the narrative, aggressively jumbling events around through Duke's exhausted mind, and incorporating many leaps forward and flashes back. The most significant changes Cox and Davies made came about halfway through, after the White Rabbit bathtub scene. At this point, they had Duke actually escaping Vegas via airplane, before receiving a telegram from Dr. Gonzo immediately after landing, instructing him to return in order to cover the district attorney's drug conference in the second half. From there, we have many familiar scenes, but again in a much different order than they would appear in the final film, such as the adrenochrome scene. Instead of breaking Duke's cohesiveness and forcing him to piece together events after the fact, it just knocks him out briefly before he attends the drug conference. The highway patrolman scene. This is what links the first and second halves in Gilliam's version. Cox and Davies placed it at the very end, just before the final scene, which portrays Duke accidentally stumbling upon the American dream in a quaint little diner, and completely failing to notice it before he drives off to disappear in the desert haze. Gilliam did shoot a version of this scene, but trimmed it from his final cut. There are also several noteworthy omissions. Aside from the flashbacks, that nasty North Vegas diner scene, where Dr. Gonzo threatens an innocent waitress with a knife, is nowhere to be seen. Gilliam wound up using this as his film's turning point towards something much darker and more sinister. But in particular, there were two major details in Cox and Davies' script that caused controversy among the production. First, they condensed two of the novel's key speeches, one on the death of the hippie movement, referred to as the Wave speech, and another centered on Timothy Leary, into one single internal monologue that takes place on Duke's flight back home at the halfway point. This was something that severely irked Layla Nabulsi, who, with her deep personal investment in this project, felt that both individual speeches were not only some of Thompson's best writing, but also the heart and soul of the story. Cox seemed to feel that they were both basically the same speech, and worked better as one. Even worse was an animated sequence Cox had written in the earliest drafts, which described Duke having fled from Vegas by airplane, being helplessly carried back, surfing atop an animated tidal wave of bones. Nabulsi claims to have had several discussions with Cox regarding the script, and that he was invariably and stubbornly committed to his interpretation of the story. She remembers that he was contentious with her from the start, viewing her automatically as some kind of enemy. Despite her efforts at maintaining a collaborative relationship, she felt he was constantly hostile, uncooperative, and antagonistic. She has even said that he actively tried to have her removed from the production. The real breaking point came when Cox met with Hunter Thompson. By all accounts, it was a total disaster, and I'll cover it in detail in part 2.